We're in 2 Kings chapter 2 is where we'll be here in just a minute. 2 Kings chapter 2. This thing is working like crazy, man. It's I can't get it to work up there half the time, and I'm hitting it like crazy right here, and it's just nailing it. Oh. Okay. So here we are. That was our review. 2 Kings chapter 2 we're looking at. We finished last week Elijah being taken into heaven. And the rest of the chapter we'll focus on Elisha as his successor. And actually that will spill over into chapter 3 as well. And then in chapters 4 through part of 6, we see a bunch of miracle clusters is what they're sometimes called, where you have a lot of miracles just back to back to back to back. And we'll see that with Elisha. Now, so where we have been, the first week we kind of talked about these locations. You'll remember Gilgal and Jericho and Bethel. And this was the route he was taking. And then Elijah came across the Jordan River with Elisha to be taken back into heaven. And we spent time talking about Moses and Elijah and how Elijah and Elisha are similar to Moses and Joshua, I should say. And so anyway, this is the end of one era and the beginning of another is what is going to be taking place. So let's back up to verse 9 and start reading, and then we are actually in 13, I think. It says, "And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, 'Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you.' And Elisha said, 'Please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me.'" And you remember, some people take that to be, when you count the miracles that are recorded, Elisha performed twice the amount of miracles of Elijah. That could be. Most likely, I think it's a reference to the double portion of the firstborn inheritance. And so he's asking to succeed Elijah, basically, is what I think he's saying. Either one of them is certainly biblical and plausible. And he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I'm being taken up from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." So if God allows you to see me taken, then that means God will allow you to be my successor. If he doesn't, then that will be for someone else. Verse 11, "And as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it. He cried, 'My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen.' And he saw him no more." And so obviously he's allowed to see it, so he's going to be the successor, and that's going to become clear here in just a minute. And when he says, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen," we talked about the same statement is made of Elisha when he is dying a little bit later in this book. And so it's not so much of Elisha saying what he is seeing, okay? He's saying something about Elijah, that Elijah was the spiritual protector of Israel. And he's going. In essence, it's kind of like a last statement made of a person's life as they are, for an example, Abraham Lincoln on his deathbed as he was dying, Edwin Stanton, who had been a very big, he was the Secretary of War, but he had been a very strong antagonist of Abraham Lincoln throughout the years, but Lincoln chose him for his cabinet. And it is well known that when Lincoln died, that Edwin Stanton said in the room with everyone, "Now he belongs to the ages." And so it's kind of like a statement like that where he's just kind of summarizing and doing some of that and looking at with great admiration who Elijah was. And so then it says, then he, that is Elisha, took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. And of course that's a symbol of mourning. And even though this is it's a happy occasion, Elisha is being taken into heaven, it's also bittersweet because he's not going to see him anymore. Their relationship basically is done. And so when you have to take over and all that pressure falls on you, it's a different story. It's a different world. It's kind of like the ending of an era. And he's not going to be able to call up, so to speak, Elijah when he has a question anymore. He's kind of the guy that everybody's going to be looking to. And so he goes through that. And then in verse 13 it says, "And he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And when he had struck the water parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. So you remember, this is how they crossed the Jordan the first time earlier in the chapter. And so with Elisha taking Elijah's mantle, that's symbolic that he's taking up his work, and then striking the water and going over on dry ground, performing the same miracle that Elijah had just performed just minutes before. He's showing that he is taking over this position. That's what everything we're reading about in the rest of 2 and 3 is Elisha is being established as the new, now not the only prophet. We've seen that. There are tons of them. We have schools of prophets. But he's being established as kind of like the dean of the prophets, the main guy that kind of oversees everybody else. So that's where he is doing. Now, in verse 15, we get a couple of different interesting stories that take place. So in verse 15, it says, "Now when the sons of the prophets," you remember that's what we call the school of the prophets, where they would train, or it's either a training school, which seems to be the most likely, where they would train prophets in certain skills and oration and things along that line. Of course, they couldn't train them in the sense that they gave them the Spirit and God would work through them, but those that God had chosen to be prophets, they could train them about how to speak, about how to handle situations. As I think I mentioned before, preaching schools in America are based off of kind of the school of the prophets model. It's considered practical and very down to earth. It's different than a university degree, I'll put it that way, okay? Their approaches, a preaching school's approach to ministry and a university's approach to training people for ministry is different. I'm not saying one is better than the other, I'm telling you that they're different, okay? And so the school of the prophet model is more practical, down to earth, what's going on. And so the sons of the prophets are here, and they're at Jericho, and they saw him opposite, and they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." That is, they realize that God has chosen him to be the new leader. And it says, "And they came to meet him," Elisha, "and bowed on the ground before him in their respect. And they said to him, 'Behold, now there are with your servants 50 strong men. Please let them go and seek your master. It may be that the Spirit of the Lord has caught him up and cast him upon a mountain or into some valley.' And he said, 'You shall not send.'" Okay? So they're thinking a couple of possibilities here. What if he's just been kind of lifted up and thrown somewhere? What if this was God's way of him exiting the world and he died and then he just left his body out there somewhere? Secret burial, maybe. That's what happened to Moses. Deuteronomy 34. God buried him in a valley over in Moab against Beth Peor, and no man knows of his sepulcher unto this day. Deuteronomy 34, 6 through 10-ish. So maybe they're thinking it's something like that. Maybe they're wanting to, obviously if he's taken up into heaven and God dropped him into a mountain or to a valley, I don't think there's much surviving that. So maybe they think he did die that way, and so they're going to give him a proper burial, which was very important to Jewish people, having a proper burial. And so they want to go and look for him. But Elisha at first says, "No, that's not going to happen." But when they urged him till he was ashamed, he said, "Send." And so they finally just wore him down. They sent therefore 50 men, and for 3 days they sought him, but did not find him. And they came back to him while he was staying at Jericho, and he said to them, "Did I not say to you, do not go?" And so what this also provides, though, is kind of like corroborating evidence. Okay? Not saying that's why it's in here. I'm saying it does provide corroborating evidence. So when you study miracles, and there are people who spend their lives studying just miracles in Scripture and looking for the validity of them based upon just what you see revealed in the text, and there are a lot of clues there. You have to train your mind to think that way. It's a different approach to things. But the 50 men searching for Elijah's body in their mind is verification of the fact that this was a legitimate translation, right? 50 men who had every incentive in the world to want to find Elijah and his body if he's dead and has been cast down into a mountain. Of all people, they had every incentive to want to find him, okay? And so their lack of finding him shows the validity of the fact that his body wasn't deposited there. They spent 3 days and covered a lot of area in order to be able to do that. So Elisha tells them, I told you you weren't going to find him to begin with. And, something similar to that happened. You remember, who's the only other person that was translated the way Elijah was? Well, we don't know exactly, but he was translated. Enoch, okay? Now, we're just simply told it in Genesis 5:24. Enoch was not, for God took him. We don't know what kind of escort he had. We don't know if anybody saw it. We do know, based on Hebrews 11, that he was searched for, it seems. That by faith Enoch was taken up that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. They searched for him. Enoch is here one day, and the next day, nobody can find him. And so there is validity to this, and these are the only 2 men who never had to die. Everyone else does. The only other exceptions to this will be those who would be alive when Jesus returns. Would be the only people who never had to experience death. But even Jesus had to experience it while he was here. So there it is. That's the end of that era. Now we're going to run into 2 stories. Really the last story is the one that's a little peculiar. And obviously when you read it, it can seem a little bit troublesome just by a surface glance. But we will get there in time. All right, verse 19. It says, "Now the men of the city said to Elisha." Now the implication seems to be the men of the city would be the men of the city of Jericho. You back up to the previous verse, your closest antecedent is in 18, and he was in Jericho. Okay, so we've talked about this. When Elijah is going to be translated, he goes Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, across the Jordan, translated. And what Elisha is going to do is go across the Jordan, Jericho, Bethel, and then he's going to go Mount Carmel, Samaria. And so they're kind of retracing their steps in what they're doing. So, behold, the men of the city said to Elisha, "Behold, now the situation of this city is pleasant, as my Lord sees, but the water is bad and the land is unfruitful." Okay, so Jericho, we mentioned it before. What's it famous for, I guess, on the beginning? Walls. First city that was conquered in the taking of the promised land in Joshua chapter 6. You also remember that when that was done, there was a curse placed upon anyone who built it. Anyone who built it would lose 2 children in the process. When he began the project, he'd lose a child, and when he finished hanging the doors at the end of the project, he'd lose a child. Now, you remember that has happened, obviously. That happened under the reign of, and it dropped me again, it's either Ahab or Omri. Let me check. Ahab. So in the reign of Ahab, it was rebuilt. Not surprising. Ahab is a very wicked guy. And so it wouldn't be surprising that wickedness would run throughout his particular country. Now, Jericho becomes an important New Testament city, right? What do we see taking place in Jericho? Kid's song about it. Wee little man. Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is in Jericho. Jericho became a very, very desirable place. Now, it seems like the reason the water is bad here was because of that original curse that had been placed upon it, okay? So there had been a curse placed upon it by God, and now it had been rebuilt, and they're coming to Elisha to see if he can fix their water problem. Now, they only received about 2 inches of rain per year. They depended upon springs and other things to help them. And apparently it was those sources that were corrupted. And Elisha is going to do something about it and, of course, make it livable here in just a moment. But in the New Testament era, it was considered a nice and a luxurious getaway place where your wealthy people would live. And it had good smell. They had certain trees there, and you could smell them for miles as you were approaching the city or leaving the city. And so it becomes really, really important in the New Testament. Verse 20, this is Elisha's response. He said, "Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it." So they brought it to him. Then he went to the spring of water and threw salt in it and said, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From now on, neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it." So the water has been healed to this day according to the word that Elisha spoke. All right. So he takes a water and puts salt in it. Salt for them had a lot of uses. It had a lot of symbolic references as well. One of the symbolic references was a break from the past. Salt kind of indicated an ending of the past and the ushering in of a new beginning. Okay? And so that kind of fits this connotation here. The ending of the old curse that was on Jericho and the ushering in of a blessing on Jericho. Okay? So the water source became very good, and it lasted and did well into the New Testament times. Now, what this shows us about Elisha establishing him as a prophet is that he has the ability to pronounce a blessing, of course, only with God's say-so, but he can reverse a curse, so to speak, and put a blessing on something. A city that God had cursed now receives a blessing. And not just anybody could do that. And Elisha is one that can do that. And so what this story is telling us is Elisha is taking his place. Okay? He's being put in an authoritative position that he can not only give a blessing, but in that blessing reverse a generations old curse in the process. Okay? Then we get to this story. Somebody read for us 23 to 25, please. Okay. So, an interesting story to say the least, right? Okay, we've got to kind of shed our American ideals if we're gonna figure this thing out. Okay, so let's look. So he goes up to Bethel. Right here, you remember Bethel is 1 Kings 12. It is where they set up calf worship. It's the center of Jeroboam's sin. 1 Kings 12 is where it's set up at the end. Chapter 13, the prophet comes and pronounces judgment on it for its sinfulness. So that's where they are. So you would see Bethel is not a faithful city. Okay? Not a faithful city. It's an idolatrous city. Pretty wholly given to their idolatry. All right? So he was going up on the way. Some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him. Does anybody's translation read different? That's ESV, some small boys. I'm sorry? Little children, okay. Some youths. Anybody else? All right. Well, the reason I ask, I'm not exactly sure why the ESV translators chose small boys. They certainly know more about the language than I do. I'm not suggesting that at all. It's just puzzling because the word means, it can indicate a person between the ages of 12 and 30. So you're dealing with a pretty broad spectrum, okay? So when we hear little kids, immediately our mind goes to like elementary school kids. And you got to remember, they're accountable to the law at age 13. Okay? They're bar mitzvah. So the fact that it is small boys, I don't know that we should make an association that our minds automatically want to make, that these are small children. These could certainly be teenagers. They could be young adults. And it seems most likely that's probably who this is. And they may have had something to do with the temple, the false worship at Bethel as well. That's why they give him such a hard time. So they come at him and they jeer at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." Now, young lads, that's probably a little bit closer. Yeah, that sounds a little bit close. That sounds, to American ears, that sounds older. To my mind, that sounds older. But, that doesn't necessarily mean anything either. But they jeer at him and say, "Go up, bald head, go up, you bald head." What they're basically saying to him is, just get out of here. We don't want you here. Okay? Bald-headed, there's been some debate about what they were meaning by that. There is some thought. The evidence, in my opinion, is circumstantial. There is some thought that the prophets at a certain point began to all shave their heads, and that was a way that they were kind of like the way they dressed in hairy garments, Zechariah 13 and verse 4, that became a symbol of being a prophet of God, was to have a bald head. I don't know if that's true or not. It's kind of hard. We don't have enough evidence to really establish a strong pattern of it. But either way, they're jeering at him. They're being disrespectful to him. And not just in a simple, here's a younger person being disrespectful to an older person, but very much so in a way of almost cursing him. And not cursing in the sense, okay, when we read curse in the Bible, don't assume that when you see the word curse that it means they start cussing each other. The word curse in the Bible has nothing to do with what we would call cuss words. Okay? Curse in the Bible has to do with calling down the curse of God upon an individual. Okay? That is calling down God's judgment on an individual. That's a curse. So when Peter, for an example, at the house of the high priest, began to curse and to swear that he did not know him, he didn't let out a string of four-letter expletives. He began to call down a curse of God upon himself, taking an oath saying, "I don't know him, and if I do know him, may God place a curse upon me." That's what he was saying. He's talking to religious people. They wouldn't have tolerated that type of language in their presence. So they're basically cursing Elisha and telling him to get out, and to let him know that he's not wanted. Okay? Something very similar to that will happen in Amos. When Amos goes to preach in the north in this same region, he will be told basically to go home. He's not wanted there. He needs to go back to where he came from. He needs to go back to the south where he's from and mind his own business. But, so they come after him. Verse 24, and he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Okay? Again, not a string of expletives, but simply calling down the curse of God upon them. Now, you remember when the law was given, there were blessings for keeping the law. God promised to bless them for keeping the law, and he lists a lot of them. And there were curses. If you don't keep the law, this is what will happen. This is what will come down upon you. And one of the curses of not keeping the law was being torn by wild animals. It seems as if God had in some ways, a protection upon them from wild animals and some accidents. To what degree, I don't know, but the fact that this would be observable and known as a punishment would be indicative. Yes, sir. Okay, we're fixing to get to that. This is not a personal vendetta, okay? because when you study the way Kings is put together and you look at this chapter, the end of this chapter, well, all of this chapter and all of chapter 3, it's establishing Elisha as the new prophet. Okay? And as the prophet, you're the representative of God. So, when you curse the prophet, you curse God. Okay? When you curse the prophet, you curse God. For an example, when Saul was on the road and the Lord appeared to him, what did Jesus ask him? Why do you persecute me? As far as we know, Saul never even saw Jesus in the flesh. How was he persecuting Jesus? He was persecuting Christians. So when we become Christians, this is Ephesians 2, and we talk about the Sunday morning class, we get synced with God, we become connected. There is a close bond that exists. And even in the prophet Zechariah, I think I always get it confused with something else. But it's in Zechariah somewhere where God says to them, he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. If they touch you, they touch me. Okay? And so that's what's going on here. It's not just Elisha's personal honor that's at stake. It's the honor of God and who he represents that's really the bigger issue. And so as a result, and by the way, notice, some people that are troubled by this story, notice Elisha does not say, let 2 she-bears come and devour him. He pronounces a curse. Who sent the bears? It wasn't him. Had to be God. 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. Anybody's translation read different than tore? Mauled? Okay. There is debate about whether they were actually killed. The word is somewhat, Hebrew is very, it's not a problem, but the challenge of Hebrew is that it's ambiguous. Okay? Greeks, when you study Greek, or Koine Greek, what the New Testament's written in, New Testament Greek is precise. You have multiple words to indicate that sometimes are translated as one word. For an example, what we'll see Sunday morning, the words translated worship in the New Testament, you would assume it's the same word, right? No. It's actually 6. 6. Of course, the most famous one, I think, is love. There are 4 words with it. Hebrew is just the opposite. Words they are very elastic, okay? They have a lot of wiggle room in them. And so it makes it somewhat challenging to always know exactly what is being said. And so both possibilities, obviously, they are attacked. And so they're at least hurt, possibly killed in the process, 42 of them. And so this is God affirming, again, Elisha as a prophet. Now, in the previous story at Jericho, we saw that he had the power to bless. Now, in Bethel, we see just the opposite. He also has the power to curse. So again, the writer of Kings is slowly but surely, with these stories, establishing something in our minds as we read the story and as it unfolds. Now, you remember Elijah, when he went Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, Jordan, translated. So now Elisha has gone over the Jordan, Jericho, Bethel, and then we come to 25. It says, from there he went on to Mount Carmel, here, which you remember 1 Kings chapter 18, the big showdown there with the prophets of Baal. And then it says from there he returned to Samaria, which was the capital of the northern tribes. And so what you're seeing is he's retracing the steps of Elijah And then he finally settles in at home, which is his main base of where he's going to prophesy, because that's where the king is. And this whole section of Kings is about the kings versus the prophets. Okay? And so, excuse me, that's Elisha kind of getting settled in here, and he's being confirmed, and now it's going to take, in the 3rd chapter, it's going to take a bigger step. Okay? Any questions or anything on that before we... Okay. Let's look at chapter 3 here. So chapter 3, this is one of those stories. The ending of it is difficult. Okay? Now, I like to read. Other people like movies. Well, not basically the same thing, but we'll call it that. Okay? There's no way. But anyway, that's a different discussion for a different time. It's storytelling, however you want to put it. Okay? Now, I don't know what your interest in story is. I don't know how you like stories to end. I don't like loose ends. I don't like loose ends. I don't like a story that ends without resolution. I think there has to be some kind of something there. Other people like it. Other books are written, and that's what you have to remember. Literature is also not just literature. Many times the person is writing with a slant. They're trying to prove something. I mean, what was The Great Gatsby really about? What was F. Scott Fitzgerald actually saying? What was he speaking out against? The worldliness of his generation. I mean, what was Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter really about? It was a time when clergy fell into a very negative viewpoint amongst the people. And so that's really what it was about. She was forced to wear the scarlet letter, while she had actually, the father of the child was actually the preacher. So he's communicating a message. So literature, when you read it, is not just, and that's what so many people miss. They think it's just a story, but it's not. Okay? And the same thing is true. I'm a John Grisham guy. I've had the chance to meet him. He talks about places that I've been in Mississippi all the time. He speaks my language. But and I love Grisham. But you see his politics. You see his beliefs and his stories. I mean, it's clear. Okay? He's trying to communicate something. Now, some stories are told. I say all that to say this. Some stories are told, whether in a movie or in a book form, to where there is purposefully no resolution at the end. For an example, there was a TV show that this one episode had to do with vaccinating children, okay? I'm not starting that debate with you. I'm telling you what it was about, okay? And it had way before COVID existed. So it was about vaccinating children in general. The unvaccinated child went to school. Another child contracted one of these diseases or issues that would have been resolved by a vaccine. Ended up dying. Charges were pressed against the parents for not vaccinating the child. And the case, you watch it unfold, and they go back and forth, and they make their arguments. And this is the way the episode ends. The foreman of the jury stands up to read the verdict, and they say, "We, the jury, find the defendant to be," and then black screen, it stops. Story's over. Why? What are they doing? It's not just entertainment. That's what we've got to understand. Entertainment is never just entertainment. They want you as the viewer on that occasion to say, how would you resolve this? It forces introspection. You're not going to rely on someone else to think through the issue for you. You're going to have to think through it based upon what you've seen. Now, That's what this chapter is going to do. At the very end, especially. Everything's going to go one direction, and at the very end, it's just going to come to an abrupt halt and no resolution whatsoever. And we're going to be left to try and figure out what's going on. Why did it happen that way? And what are we supposed to learn from it? How are we supposed to think through it? So I think we'll stop there. I don't want to just jump into it and only get like 2 verses in. So, and as far as the overall theme of establishing Elisha as a prophet, this 3rd chapter is the next step in that establishment, because he's established to the sons of the prophets in verses 15 through 18. And in verses 19 through 22, he's established to the people of Jericho. And then at the last story with the she-bear, he's established to the people of Bethel. And now in 2 Kings 3, he's going to be established to the new king of Israel. His word will stand and be established there. And so that's kind of the next logical step. And then we'll get into a series of miracles that will also give evidence to who he is. All right? We'll pick up there hopefully next week.